Underneath the bridge, the top has sprung a leak, and I'm living off of grass, and the drippings from the ceiling. It's okay to eat fish, 'cause they don't have any feelings. Something in the way, something in the way, yeah.
PlayStation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the live stream today on Naughty Dog. We're on Twitch and YouTube. I'm Arne Meyer. I'm the Director of Communications at Naughty Dog. I wanted to put out a shout out to Dina for hosting the Dreams stream last week, so thank you very much for doing that. And today we're getting kicked off with the first in the series of playthroughs through Last of Us Remastered, which came out in 2014. It was the PS4 version of our 2013 game, The Last of Us. And we're going to be doing a bunch of playthroughs for The Last of Us Remastered leading up into the next couple months. We're going to do everything we can to bring you a bunch of interesting guests as well. So be sure to follow and subscribe us to us on Twitch and YouTube. Turn on notifications so you know when we're streaming. As always, the bad news is that we won't be talking about The Last of Us Part 2 today. We won't be answering Last of Us Part 2 questions either, but please come and participate on our chat. And if you're on Twitch, you can also leave us questions in the Q&A panel down below. You can upvote if you see any questions that are interesting, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. If you're on mobile, please be sure to click the blue and green circle at the top of the chat. And again, we'll try to answer as many questions as we are together. And I'm sure everyone's wondering who are we. If you haven't been following us on Twitter, we've got two really great guests to kick it off today. Neil Druckmann, who is the director of The Last of Us Part 2, and Kurt Margenau, the co-game director of The Last of Us Part 2. But that's what you're doing now. What did you work on in the original game? Kurt?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Let's just talk about Last of Us 2.
I was a designer on Last of Us 1. I was very involved in what we're about to play. The opening part of the game was my life for about 4 or 5 months. And
Kurt was actually on Uncharted 4 at the time and got pulled to help us
all hands on deck.
finish this opening that needed a lot of help, and Kurt helped kind of bring it all together into.
Was this always going to be the opening?
It was always going to be the Outbreak, but we had different versions of how you would see the Outbreak. For a long time, on paper, it was you were going to play as Joel, going to your neighbor's house, seeing your neighbor infected, having your first fight there before you run back to your house to get Sarah and escape. And pretty late in production, very close to the end when we finally were able to put resources on the opening of the game, just because we make things out of order, that we decided to see it all through Sarah's perspective, and that was such a fresh take that really inspired us to do the opening as it kind of ended up.
Did we prototype taking it from Sarah's perspective, or was this a decision where we're going straight to saying, oh, we want to start with Sarah as the perspective, and then we just went all in, or was there a
I don't think there was a prototype. If I might be misremembering now, it's been so many years, but I feel like we threw Ellie's moveset or something on Sarah and just walked around, and right away it felt like, oh, this is so cool and so scary to see it through a little kid's perspective as everything's happening, and was a cool introduction to Joel to see him through Sarah's eyes and get you to. I don't think at the time we could articulate it, but it was able to create so much empathy for Sarah so quickly by you playing as her, and it's something we've leveraged ever since.
When you came on, Kurt, when you came on to The Last of Us, how far along was this? What did you have to pick up?
It was, the last couple months of the project, and it was, there was a structure there. It was all the beats were there of it was going to be Sarah. It's all the geo was kind of built for it, and it was just scripting and bringing in the animations and polishing and kind of deciding where control is and how much control, especially in the car part, which was originally designed as just kind of a big cutscene where you weren't going to have any control, and then making it work so that you can look everywhere and she moves around the car and stuff, and figuring out the crowd scenes. There was no crowd tech really. We had to kind of cobble something together at the last second, getting 100 infected running through the streets. The whole moveset of Joel. We're spoiling the whole opening before we even play it. But there's a ton of technical stuff that's used just for the opening 20 minutes, and it's kind of a.
Did you ever work on the original design where you're supposed to be, when you're carrying Sarah, there's going to be a crowd you're running with, and you're going to try to stay in the middle, and in fact they're going to pick off the edges?
That kind of is what the game is.
It kind of, but we had more of a gameplay idea of
There is a dynamic people will run in the streets and will kind of dynamically get attacked if they come to certain spots. They're sort of scripted, but it's sort of it's dynamic enough because they can avoid you and different things. And
I just remember we had much more ambitious of oh, you as a player need to put people between you and the infected to kind of sacrifice them to save your daughter, and at the end it turned out we didn't need something so complex, but that came to mind.
So I wasn't going to ask unless you brought it up, but you brought it up, and so I think our viewers would really be interested in knowing, like, what exactly is scripting? Like, what is that role?
Scripting. It's not writing the script of the game, as some people think. Like back years
Why you
ago,
gotta say it
I
like
would.
that? Why you gotta say it?
Because, well, I just remember when I started working at Naughty Dog, and I would tell people what I do, and they're like, "Oh, scripting." I'll go, "Oh, so you write the story, write the scripts?" Like, no, different script. It's like code script that is, the way I try to describe it, it's like where programming and design kind of intersect. It is programming for designers. It's like a higher level language that exists in the engine with the purpose of creating an experience for the player where you don't care about like memory management or all the other really hardcore things that a programmer has to manage on a console. You just get to, oh, I'm playing this animation here, I'm tweaking this blend, I'm creating this like perfect authored experience of this thing happens, then this thing happens. I go into this region, I turn these settings on, like very, very powerful control that scripters have to kind of turn every feature of the game on and off at any moment, and to play animations in millions of different ways. Can prototype, early in production, can prototype entire mechanics just using the scripting language, and then kind of develop them into more code-based things with programmers.
When Kurt started out, he quickly became one of our scripting experts, and like one of his first big tasks was the collapsing building in Uncharted 2, which became our E3 demo for that game, and that's kind of like where he cut his teeth on and helped define what is like a Naughty Dog set piece for at least for the Uncharted series.
We didn't really know, because it was like, I was young, I was stupid, I didn't know like what you can't do. And I remember Neil and Bruce coming with like this animatic of a helicopter and this building, and like it fires missiles and it's like collapsing, and I remember being like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like, yeah, we can, sure, I guess. It's like,
And
well,
then
you had some doubts about whether it's all going to come together and it's going to work, and like just it's going to be fine. It's going to work. We got top people on this, and it did work. It worked out great.
Cool. Well, why don't we get started?
we'll start playing the game.
So again, just going back to scripting, when we talk about
Do I have to make a new save?
scripting in this opening sequence, what were the types of things that you would have to script?
I remember my life being the car ride. The car ride was the hardest thing. Because remember, we're on PS3. I remember like these, I've turned into the old man. So when you go to GDC and you see the talks from like the old timers from like the arcade days, and the whole talk is always just, we had 256 kilobytes of memory and we were doing blah, blah, blah. I'm now that, but on PS3, where it's like, we had 75 megabytes of level heap, and we had to stream in while they're like auto-downloading the game, this incredible like sequence where you can look 360. So there was a lot of streaming. And
is it because how fast the car is moving and how much we had to load as the car is driving?
It was like making sure everything loaded in time, chopping up the levels into the right pieces, because you could be downloading, because we wrote our own like auto-downloader thing that Christoph wrote on PS3 before you could like.
It's Sarah. I haven't seen Sarah in a really long time.
Tommy, listen to me. He is the contractor. He's the contractor.
When we shot this with Hannah, who plays Sarah, we shot this whole kind of montage of her like eating, waiting for her dad, playing a video game, like reading, and then going to sleep. And I just felt like, we didn't need all that. Let's just start with her already sleeping.
Well, all right. So I mean, we talk about this scene. What is it that we're trying to establish here? Just in this immediate, like this is the first time you're playing. You don't know who you're playing. You're going straight to a cutscene. What is it that we're trying to establish between the relationship between them?
I mean, we have so little time to kind of like, all this is working towards the moment where Joel loses his daughter, and you have to understand how this event changes this man irreversibly. So right away we have to like establish these characters, establish their relationship, establish why you should care about them, how they care about each other. And this little kind of like moment where it's like his birthday and she gives him a gift, and I don't know if at the time when we wrote this we knew like how much the watch becomes a symbol of their relationship for the rest of the game. I think that's just something that organically evolved as we were making the game.
Drugs. I sell hard.
It helps that she's funny.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things too is that Hannah was pretty young, but we then had Ashley, who was an adult, also playing a younger woman. What was the choice in making someone be the same age as, I mean, because clearly we have that freedom, right? You don't have to have the same actor.
Yeah, it was
model or
obviously to
anything.
create the parallels of like, can this man ever pick up the pieces of where he left off raising this girl? And I remember and we auditioned a lot of people for Sarah, but it's kind of the same story you hear with a lot of our roles. Like as soon as like Hannah walked in, and the dynamic between her and Troy, and just how much emotion she was able to bring to these pretty short scenes, right? Like so quickly, it was right away like she's got to be our Sarah.
Hello?
Sarah, honey, I need to get your daddy on the phone.
Uncle Tommy, what time is it?
I need to talk to your dad now. There's something.
And then just,
Uncle Tommy?
I think it's often underappreciated how much storytelling happens through environment art. Like if you look around this room, that is something so many people have contributed to, is like just the soccer balls, how much that tells you about her personality. And
Well, I was always
the
interested.
pictures on the walls.
I think I've never asked, but I was always interested. Like, why is the first thing you have is the mirror? So like you're seeing the reflection of Sarah as the first thing that you're playing.
I don't know if it was a conscious thing, but it is something nice of like, we never advertised that you're playing anybody other than Joel, to kind of make a statement. Or you're standing up like, oh, I'm playing as Sarah, like, okay. And people that have no idea, and I haven't had the game spoiled, them are always really surprised by that.
Yeah, I remember watching focus testers come in, and that cutscene where she picks up the phone and she's just standing here like this, and people are like,
Yeah, and they're waiting,
what?
like, oh, this is
wait, what?
Yeah, and some people
Oh.
even come like, this is a weird cutscene, like nothing's happening. Like, oh, I'm playing.
Like, oh.
Well, there's a lot of things you can pick up when we were just talking about. There's all these things in the room that provide some of that environmental storytelling. How much of this, I mean, you're starting to play the game, you're starting to get to know what it is. How much of this is training the player to really like pick up pick up the subtleties of what's in the environment, to sort of learn a little bit more about the story, feel that they're grounded in the world.
Yeah, when we write this stuff, there's like the A storyline, things the player has to know. The B storyline, things that are important about relationship, and then like C storyline, like for example, this newspaper starts hinting at like, okay, how did this outbreak happen?
Here it is. One of my contributions to the lore of The Last of Us was the date on this newspaper, because I remember
Wasn't it oh, go ahead.
there was like, what date should it be? And we're like, I don't know. And we remember seeing like, there's like something in Billstown that says October. Like, oh, okay, it's like sometime before then. What day of the week is it? Okay, well, we'll just pick like September 26th. And then we put it on there. And it's now like Outbreak Day. It's like a big part of our thing. But it was just from like, oh, this texture for this newspaper needed a date on it. And that's like the day.
So like a missed thing is like it says like contaminated crops. Like we had a whole kind of backstory of like how we thought this thing spread so quickly, is like the idea that this fungus got into a bunch of crops and a bunch of people ingested it in a pretty similar time frame, and that's why it was able to just blow up.
Why did we pick Texas as the starting point for the game?
Probably because of No Country for Old Men. It's just more of like we figured out who Joel is and then worked backwards from there, and what would be an interesting place to start in.
Well, we talk about No Country for Old Men. I know we talked about in interviews, but like, what were some of the inspirations for both the tone and sort of the setting, right? Like, we've talked about the book, The World Without Us, as well.
Where the heck are you?
Are there other inspirations that?
That's nearby.
Yeah, I mean, just I just love this bit, and then how like
What was that?
I remember we iterated quite a bit on the noise of like the window rattling and needed that to sound right.
Dad?
But yeah, there's this idea we talked about a lot, is like this threat is happening somewhere else, and something we never wanted to do with this game is get into like, okay, how did this thing start? What is case zero? What is the government doing exactly? Like it's all should be seen from a family perspective. So the idea that it's happening far, and now you're going to see cop cars driving by, and it's like, and it's slowly coming closer and closer and closer, until obviously it's like it's in your house when Joel shoots his neighbor, and you need to get away.
Sure. And one of the things, like, what changes do we do in the animation? So one of the things I really appreciated is like Sarah gets up when she's still upstairs and she feels sleepy on the stick.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how much are we doing that through affecting the responsiveness of the game versus just the animations feel that way?
Well, yeah, there's all these little gestures that she plays here. She's got her kind of cold, and she's touching her face, and she's like rubbing her eyes, and it's this whole, these little animations that can just play on top of the movement.
Right, and once she sees the explosion, her demeanor changes.
Yeah.
And this is a lot of stuff that, you know, the animation department is looking at the story, looking at the beats, and trying to figure out, okay, with the engineering, with the kind of technical system that we have, how can we leverage those to tell the story, to make you invested in this character?
One of the things I noticed when we were playing through this is that there's a lot of, it seems like there's ticking clocks in the background a lot. We talk about you didn't necessarily realize the symbol in the watch when you were shooting this. How much was there a potential that, okay, now time is running out, may have become sort of a subtext to it or a subconscious bit?
I don't know when that came on, but even like with the opening title cards, you hear a ticking clock. And this idea of like a watch and clock and time is this motif. Some crazy noise
Yeah, what is that?
happening upstairs.
I remember this reflection in the window being
Yeah, I remember
big
being
deal.
blown away when
on
I saw this.
PS3,
Like,
it was like, oh, reflection. It was really tricky. I want to see if you can go backwards into that.
When we were talking about, you know, it was really interesting
are
to,
you trying to break your own script?
Well, we were talking this morning about, oh, you can't go backwards into this, but you can go forwards into it. That's that scripting right here, because Animation Blend only works forwards.
There you are.
Sarah,
That's right, he's talking.
are you
I
okay?
remember we had an iteration on like this because there was certain angles you couldn't see what Joel was doing. It was important to see that he was taking out a gun.
Don't go near the
Yeah,
door.
I remember this was more restrictive. We let you like walk around. There's more tension in it to be able,
What's going on?
just like watching him being in this room.
Something ain't right with them. I think they're sick.
what's the importance to like show that Joel has to kill someone here,
Jimmy!
Dad?
like right off the bat?
It's the stakes. It's like here, right? It's like kill or be killed. This whole sequence is about survival, and he's like, the idea is like he's trying every step of the way to like get this person not to not shoot them, and then having to shoot someone in front of his daughter, and in front of you as the player playing the daughter, is like establishing the stakes.
There is something bad going on. And we've got to get out of here. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
Tommy, come on.
So now we get to meet Tommy for the first time. Obviously, he was on the phone earlier before he gets cut off.
going on out there?
Got some notion.
And so this is a moment where we get to start to understand what the relationship is between Joel and Tommy, in like a very little bit as well. Can you talk about sort of like what the choice was to introduce Tommy this early as part of it?
I mean, again, because so much of the journey is to go later on, is to go find Tommy. We need to spend enough time with him, establish there's some moral difference between Joel and Tommy, which we'll see on this car ride when they see a family walking by. But well, the thing that does come to mind is it was written in such a way of like two adults having a conversation, almost forgetting there's a kid in the background, and then kind of having more to censor themselves because there is a kid in here. And again, it's all under this idea of like just protecting your child. Like so much of the theme of this game is the unconditional love a parent feels for their child. Is already you've seen several moments where we're showing that to you, and we're about to get to a bunch more.
Was this always meant to be where you as Sarah could like move around and check out the environment the entire time, or was there ever a moment where maybe it was more of a pure
I
cutscene?
think it was always look around, but there wasn't this
remember-
idea of her moving.
Right. Like, it was so static to have her just be
Yeah.
in the center. So we have this kind of 360. The whole point is there's a lot of stuff going on around you. Put you in this place. Let me look in all directions. Because it always sucks in games when you get that, like,
Of course not.
in the car ride and you can't look past 90 and there's like something passing you can't see it because for performance reasons or whatever, unloading
You could
things.
aim, right? And
Yeah, you can zoom in
yeah.
and just like
All right.
where she puts her hands on the car and stuff. There's actually a little hack where, because the camera would clip through the back seat of this car, we actually fold the seat down
Keep driving, Tommy.
Yeah, when
just when it's off screen so that the camera doesn't have issues with the back seat. Hollywood magic.
So we were talking earlier when the neighbor comes in, the Coopers come in, and Joel has to kill him, and it's about establishing the stakes. So here, I think, with that family, obviously we're talking about the moral choice, but I think this is the first time we're really introducing, okay, we're putting we're also going to put characters in tough choices, because I think that was a no-brainer, right? We're being attacked, I need to protect my
I
family.
mean, that moment tells you everything you need to know about Joel to understand why he does what he does at the end of the game.
Sure.
He really doesn't change much as far as like, this guy will do anything to protect his family.
Did you know? I guess did you know that line to the end of the game where did you already know that was a through line?
Yeah, that trajectory was always there, of like that Joel will sacrifice all of humanity to save Ellie. So once we wrote the ending later, that moment with the family naturally came out of that.
We can't stop here, Tommy. I can't fucking drive through them, Joel! Back up there! They're behind me, too! There! Hold on! Go!
I'm having flashbacks though. How many times we had to like, just to get that moment with
rumble?
the timing and the crash and all that, just so many iterations to get that to feel good.
And it mirrors a lot of the Pittsburgh crash too, right? Like you're getting T-boned by something. We're establishing part of it. What I really appreciated, and it was really funny, because obviously having worked here and everything, like played this a million times, I didn't realize how I didn't think for 1 second that it was odd that all of a sudden I'm playing Joel. Like I was totally sold into that. I mean, obviously this makes, story-wise, it makes for a good transition, but did you always planning to sort of build this transition, or do you have other ideas of how do we transition to play to Joel?
I think we had this whole, again, I don't know if we could articulate why it was good in the way that we can now, but there's like, if you think about it, there's a sort of a handoff. You're playing as Sarah, there's a car crash that happens, and now her leg is hurt, and now you're going to be carrying her. So it's almost like the two characters are combined into one, and then once she passes, now you're just this one character what's left.
We're gonna need to run.
What I really liked is in that, the way that Joel looked at Tommy there, it's like Joel clearly did what he had to do to save his family. He saying, leave that people around. But to me, I feel, maybe I'm imbuing my own feelings to it, but it looked like he looked at Tommy going, did you really just kill that guy? Like, even though he saved him, it sort of felt like that's what he was doing there.
No.
Remember we had issues with people able to see Tommy in this thing? So he's wearing like this pink shirt. Oh no. Just because the player can get turned around and they need to know where Tommy is all the time.
Sure.
We actually kind of fake his
Ambience.
yeah, we call it ambient scale. It's the lighting on the
lighting on,
character.
yeah.
So he's a little brighter, and he's wearing a color that no other like crowd member is wearing. So you can always find him again.
This is like the difficulty of making a chase sequence is that you're looking forward, but your threat is often behind. So there's all these brainstorms of like, what can we put in front of you so you could see the chaos.
Sure.
And then later when you have to get chased, when we get to that part, there's light so we can cast shadows past you, because again, you're only looking forward, you're not looking backwards, unless you're playing like a Crash Bandicoot section where you're running towards the camera.
Are there any references we should be thinking about in the theater movie names?
I don't even
Do
remember
you know
what
where they
the
came from?
movie names
One
are.
of them was Damocles Rising. I think there was Armadillo Fever up there.
Okay, no,
It's just like brainstorming for stuff.
I wasn't part of that.
Well, what I found really interesting is like when you're talking about you're running forward and all these threats, is like we do a really good job. Obviously, if you slow down, there's those moments where the infected will catch up, but you do a really good job feeling that there's tension behind you, and you don't really know. Like it's that unknown part. Like you think even as a person, it's like, oh, I don't really want to look over my shoulder, but it always feels like there's somebody like right at your heels.
Yeah, which is why it's important earlier on to, like here it's like you're pretty safe. But earlier on, we had to establish that you can get nabbed, just so the parts where you're safe, you're not thinking about it, you're just moving forward. Here, like, there's a light there, and those like ribbons
Trying to get people to go here. It's
because
like,
often
go
people
to
get turned around and like go somewhere
like,
else in
"Where
the
do I
parking lot.
go?"
And
Oh no, that's what happens. If you wait too long.
Come on, Kurt.
Trying to check out.
so
the
what
environment.
difficulty are you playing on?
All right.
He's gonna be fine.
Well, I think here too, right? We're establishing a little bit of the
this light
language.
with
Sure,
the
there's a
shadow.
light, but there's a yellow tape. Yellow ends up
So here we
becoming
get
something.
reestablished, right? There's stuff chasing you through the
Right.
shadows because we don't want you to get turned around. And then- Pretty seamless considering this is pre-rendered.
We're safe. We're safe. Hey, we need help.
Stop!
Please.
This is
My dog-
Ruben
her
Langdon
leg's broken.
Stop right there!
of Devil May Cry fame playing the soldier.
We're not sick.
Got a couple of civilians on the outer perimeter.
He plays a lot of our clickers, and he plays James,
Go back for him.
David's right-hand man later on in the game.
There's a little girl. But yes,
Got
sir.
some roles in Last of Us 2 as well.
Somebody we've just been
No one
through
else is
hell.
talking about it.
We just need
We can talk about it in that context. Shouldn't be spoiling the story.
I don't know if there's anything else we could say about this scene that hasn't been already said.
I know
so many times.
this still gets to me every time. Like, no matter how many times I know that this is coming, always gets hard to watch.
Maybe the thing that's not as appreciated is like what a performance Jeffrey gives as Tommy, and just like that. Again, we have these 3 actors in this scene. I mean 4 with Ruben, but he gets shot pretty early on.
be okay, baby.
And they're all so committed to this moment.
Pick you up.
And we shot this so many times that
Come on, baby.
there were some people on the stage, like some crew members, that walked out. It was so hard for them to watch this girl die over and over and over for us trying to get this right that they left the stage.
How do you keep?
By the way, I never thought when we did this, and I don't know, Kurt, if you remember, like we had somebody. I never thought we'd be able to leave this in the game. I thought someone from up high will come down and say, "You can't show this. This is too much. Take it out." Because I've never seen something like this in a video game, but it felt so important for the story for you to feel this moment.
Well,
it just shows the kind of faith Sony had in us to allow us to leave that in.
And I mean, I think that's. I mean, it does set up the whole game like so well. Like it is that pivotal.
Naughty Dog production.
How do you keep the actors like in that moment, like as you're having to reshoot this? Because that's a really emotionally hard scene. I know everyone that works on it, like you're putting your all into it. So is there?
It's actually keeping them in the moment wasn't hard. It's actually changing what's happening because they're so in the moment. But if you're trying to go for something that's a little bit different, and Troy talks about this a lot, but like wanted something different from Joel in that. It was hard to steer it in another direction because the scene is just so powerful that for you to like almost an actor, and it's to Troy's the compliment just what a good actor he is, that able to just step back and steer your emotions in a totally different way than what like your instinct is telling you to do. That was really hard.
So we're learning a lot about the world through the titles. How are we meant to interpret that? Is this meaning to catch us up in that gap?
Yeah,
as well?
this essentially it's like, and we recorded way more lines than what ended up there, but it's like, it's also how the whole reason we have an opening credits was to create some space, because for a while we didn't have the opening credits, and it went straight from that to this, and this is where we introduced Tess, and we're kind of establishing the rules of this quarantine zone and what's going on here, and we found that players were not paying attention. Because they're so like taken aback by what just happened, they're reeling from that and they're not listening to what these 2 characters are now saying to each other. So the opening credits helped us create that space for people to just kind of recollect themselves. But then we used it as an opportunity. It's like, okay, well now we can just do a lot of exposition as we're kind of have these cool kind of fungal growth happening to let you give you some hint about the gap. Obviously, there's things we hit on again later on. But just to kind of establish, like, here's what went down between the outbreak and this point.
And some foreshadowing, of course, too.
It was the first opening credits we ever did too.
That is the first opening credits we ever did.
It was because of this narrative need for.
And now you just can't get rid of it.
And now they have open credits. It's like, well,
credits.
it's cool now.
Well, but it's also, I mean, you were saying you put that gap in, but I think it's also one of those things where it lends it to this more cinematic feel. It lends more weight to what you're watching. I'm sure you went through a really dark period, but it's like there's I don't want to say there's like a higher level of polish or professionalism to it, but it felt like, oh, there's something more important here because of how we were leading into those credits.
And a bunch of us have been fans of opening credits in other games. Metal Gear Solid stands out, or even I believe the opening to Half-Life is like just kind of setting a tone of what you're about to experience.
GTA 4.
He figures he's
GTA 4
gonna
had like
get
the
us
opening credits
first.
over the.
I think so.
When he's on the boat and stuff. It was cool.
I've always paid attention a lot to credit sequences. That was actually something I thought I was going to get into, was to be like a credits designer. So it was like really interesting to see that take shape.
Old warehouse
and sort of like
area
what we
fire.
went through, because I've always really
Can't
liked
say
the
for
stuff
how
like what
long.
Imaginary Forces was doing. Like, they did Seven, or Kyle Cooper did like Seven and Gattaca and stuff like that. So like to see us do that was like really interesting. Like work with the folks in San Diego to sort of create the fungal growth animation.
It's like the quarantine zone is also another place that came together pretty late in production and just trying to like, I believe you used to walk down the stairs and do this whole thing, and it was just trying to distill it down and cut and trim to like what are the bare essentials we need to tell this story, because often our problem with Naughty Dog is we just have too much, and it's like what's the essential that we need to get this done. I believe this is Laura Bailey here, who plays Mystery Woman in Part 2 and
What about you, Joel?
the nurse at the end of this game.
Yeah.
So again, we're going back to environmental storytelling. We're seeing not only what the government's saying with the curfew, but then we're starting to see there's a resistance, or there's people who are not trying to feel that way.
That's kind of the fun of this was, how do we withhold information from the player and like trust them to figure things out and put things together? So like here, like
This little scene here.
yeah, there's that's weird that different kind of firefly graffiti.
Oh, it's like the FF.
Yeah, the
Remember
reversed
that.
Fs.
Must be running low again.
Well, how much of it was this like deliberate maybe intention that you wanted the player to learn about the world as part of this opening sequence, instead of giving them a lot of
that's
giving them
such a big part of it, because we knew we're going to hold off on the action for a while. So we wanted like everywhere you go there'll be something to find out. Like here, just where we wanted to establish that it's oppressive, and there's several moments where we show you how oppressive it is. If you go up against a soldier multiple times,
Yeah,
they'll again, they'll
eventually shoot you.
So that was my question is like I feel like when I've played other games, you're just gonna get pushed back, right? Like they're gonna be like, no, we don't want to put that stake. So what you're clearly trying to say, okay, well, the stakes of this world, like even if you think it's not just a game, right? These aren't these gamey things.
Yeah, and like the soldier shooting, it's a pretty niche thing. Very few people do that, but we wanted to say, for people that are trying to kind of push the boundaries, you always have those players that they want to see what are the rules, or like where do things break. We wanted to show them the stakes are always there. So even though it's an investment that few people see, it felt like it was worth it.
Yeah,
these are like a lot of brainstorm. Like, okay, what is that queue of like people waiting for rations look like? If you walk by, there's all these conversations that happen about waiting for rations and understanding how important rations are, because this drives kind of the opening of the game of like why Joel and Tess take on this job to find weapons so they exchange it for rations. Why, if they don't have the weapons, do they need this girl and like deliver her out of the city? So it's building their wants, which at first are not about protecting a girl or like finding some redemption for herself. It's about just surviving in this quarantine zone.
Yeah, actually, I'd never tried going back to the soldier until I was playing through for this. It was the first time I'd tried that and actually had realized about that. What's interesting too, in terms of like the environmental storytelling, I know Kurt is sitting here watching this, but like this still happens off screen if you move forward and you hear the gunshot.
Yeah. Hold her down.
Do it.
Which I think we could have taken the choice where it's like it's waiting for you, or maybe it doesn't happen, or that sort of thing.
And again, this established different stakes for later, but this is a setup of like, if you're caught with the infection, there's no asking questions, there's no further testing, that's it, you're dead. So therefore, when Ellie gets tested positive, we understand why things had to go down the way they did, and why she can't go back to the city. The tilted buildings is something we added later. It's like, okay, once we know there's going to be a level like that, then we could add it to what we call the wide, which is like the part of the environment that's further that you can interact with. But it helps us when we know certain payoffs. The way production works, we could do the setups for them after the fact.
Better not mention the fireflies too loudly.
Why did we introduce sort of this optional dialogue there? Obviously, earlier when we met two people, they're having the conversation, you can just barge in. And now we're adding the optional dialogue, which I believe this is the first time we've even put this in the game.
I believe this was something, first we added those with Ellie, and we wanted to have moments where we give the option for the player to slow down the pacing if they want to have more conversation, there's more information they want to find out. But here there's so many opportunities to see how people interact with each other. Then if you go up to those two guys in the wall, you hear them kind of like one person kind of stepping up to Joel and just kind of establishing how Joel is feared in this city.
They caught him trying to use fake ration cards.
Jesus.
No, it's
Were
not
they
Steve.
There's one guy that talked to me earlier.
Yeah, I guess it's the guy around the corner. I forget. I haven't played this in so long.
A lot of it too is like when people play these things, and you'll see playtesters like if you see two people talking, you kind of have this expectation that they're going to recognize the player in the world, that they're going to look at you, glance at you, maybe talk with you. So you have to have enough coverage for like these conversations to overhear things that. Yeah,
By the way,
they can-
all this gameplay, this whole is like an evolution of the village we did in Uncharted 2. Uncharted 2 was the first time we did something like that. And it felt really successful. It felt like, oh, that becomes one of the tools we have. It doesn't need to be balls to the wall action all the time. There's moments where we could slow down and let you just explore and look around. There's like so much value in that, of immersing you in this space. This is like a brainstorm of like, wait,
How do we train you to turn around?
yeah, but it's doing double duty. It's like establishing that the Fireflies are this group of like quote-unquote terrorists, but it's also like establishing like we gave you some damage so you could heal yourself later, and we're teaching you how to run. And we're looking for as many opportunities to just not have pure training, like in a kind of a gamey way, but like how do we incorporate into the story, into the flow of what you're doing.
We skipped over Tess a little bit, who's played by Annie Wershing.
Yourself up, all right?
How did the character of Tess come about, and how did we decide that Joel and Tess were going to be the partners at the beginning and sort of build a relationship?
Yeah, part of it is like wanting to delay Joel taking on Ellie as a mission. So we needed someone to play the counterpart to that.
Inside the wall.
And also, and this kind of happened even after casting, is like show another sacrifice that happens along the way, that like
See that shit?
I was there.
through Tess,
Hey, how's the East
It's clear.
we get Joel to commit to
No patrols.
taking Ellie on
Where
this
are you
journey.
off to?
And it's because
Gonna pay
Tess
Robert.
makes, like, it's her final, it's her dying wish. And then working backwards, okay, how do we build up this character? And we really like the idea that
Marlene.
normally, like, you're the guy in charge or whatever. Like, you know, in Uncharted, Nathan Drake is the one making all the plans. And we wanted to say, okay, Joel's this inarticulate guy. He's more of like a thug
Hey, you
in
stay
this
out of trouble,
world.
all right?
And there's
Military
even now,
people
like you're seeing,
forced in.
Tess is doing all the talking. Joel is her muscle. And this idea that like Tess is going to make all the decisions, and then Joel's really kind of left on his own once Tess is taken out, and he doesn't know quite how to handle it.
Marlene looking
And he's
for-
always looking for an out,
What do you make of
and he
that?
just can't find it, and that puts him in a situation where he's
Find
going
him before the
to
Fireflies.
connect with this girl more and more out of circumstance and out of choice, at least initially.
door blockers.
Yeah, this is so much like conversation about how do we show doors you can interact with versus ones that you can't, and that's what we came up with this language of like, okay, the military put up these kind of strange locks, but right away it builds this language like, and when you spin the camera, you see those locks, like right away you know like I don't need to interact with these doors, I can move on.
How we looking over here?
So in this part too,
Signs of military.
we're obviously introducing a buddy NPC. So what are some of the gameplay, game design,
Joel, give me a
scripting
hand with this.
challenges now that we're dealing with two players
On screen, or not necessarily two players, but two characters we have to pay attention to all the time.
Everything, even that little scene there of walking down the hallway with Tess in front of you, and then that other NPC comes up, walks, has a conversation with Tess while you're walking, and if the player stops, they stop, like, they all keeps pace with you, but you can never like catch up with them. That kind of stuff, like presenting conversations in a natural way. Just getting
God, this place
the
reeks.
buddy to
need to watch me throw away
move.
down here.
Wow, this is really dark. Oh, okay.
She's got to turn on the lights.
Making the buddies feel useful, part of like design. Like the buddies doing things like
And then
turning
making
lights
them
on for you.
feel independent.
Yep.
Like a lot of our work is we don't want you to just control them like they're a mechanic. It's making them feel surprising.
We want them to feel independent, that they have their own personality and character, that they can surprise you with things.
So again, here we're learning a lot about, obviously we're learning different things. I'm going to point out,
Catch
there's
still
the
here
yellow
from last
part,
time.
but I think we're also learning that their stuff is here. I think it's starting to teach us a little bit, okay, there's things that we need to pick up in the environment. And where this eventually leads up into scavenging and parts and obviously our upgrade system. How early on did we decide that we were going to think about scavenging as a mechanic and as a layer to the game?
Oh, pretty early on, little team did research about surviving out in the wild and how you can build things.
What? Oh, I have to reload.
Again, training. Again, I'm just like kind of in awe of like how much environmental storytelling we're doing here. Is like just the fact that they have this tunnel that they know about, and there's other crew members that they work with. Initially, from the early version of the story, there was like a much bigger crew that they were a part of, and there was like Tess had a brother, and there was like all these extra characters, and again, it's like distilling it like, what are the bare essentials that we need, and it was like just eventually just whittled down to just Joel and Tess or the whole crew.
Trying to show off this IK pointing of the character to follow you when they reach out to you, instead of just a single animation. It's that thing of making sure that they feel real, they feel human, that they're tracking you, they're doing a thing a person would do.
Remember, like, this is one of the areas that when you come out here and you see the overgrowth, once like the lighting was there, everything was there, I was like so impressed with how beautiful this part right here looks. And you walk out and you see the overgrowth for the first time. And it was important to just do a lot of iteration of it. It's like, it's the first time you see it, it was like, oh, nature reclaiming our domain. It's like this thing we've talked about so much in production. It's the first time we have to show that off.
Got your ways.
Why did we end up picking Boston as the start? Obviously, it does set up, okay, it's easy to cross the country, but there's a lot of places in the East Coast. But was there anything specific to Boston as far as architecture, layout, or something? Or
Don't recall. And like I remember the important things, like we started on the East Coast, we
Where's
went
the
from
ladder?
east to
It's
west.
got to be around here somewhere.
There's something, so much of the language or like the aesthetic is like this kind of American landscape, and I feel like there's so much American history, like starting in Boston, and then later you go to a museum, and that's picked on purpose for that kind of reason.
Hey, try over there.
But beyond that, I'm sure there are other reasons I just don't remember.
Okay, found it.
Were there, so as far as this opening part, once we get past the normal life in the quarantine zone, were there any changes or any differences in terms of like how we were going to progress up to this point a little bit further that we were thinking about? Or was this always like pretty much sketched out?
As far as I can recall, this was pretty like the outline didn't change much. Which there was this idea that they have to go outside the city to take the shortcut, which is where we would introduce the infected, and how to fight them and train that
You must be thinking
before we
of
kind of
something
sneak back into the city. I think the market where we're going to next, this kind of black market, used to be more ambitious, which again got whittled down to more manageable ideas.
So that little moment there, just to like call out some of the like design things that we're always thinking about, ways of getting the buddy in front of you because them being in front of you means they're on screen more, means that you're going to see what they do more, makes them cooler. So we're always like trying to figure out ways of how do we get them in front of you without like when you have control. So here it's like we want the player to solve this puzzle of finding the ladder because that's cool gameplay. We pick up the ladder, we place it down, and off of that mechanic of placing it down, we have just a little, we call it IGC, in-game cinematic, even though it's not, it's just a little animation. And he just like holds the ladder, Tess goes up, and then you get control back. It's just like this quick little thing that you don't think anything of. It really has this design, it's this design solution of like, oh, we get the buddy in front of you, so now she can be on screen, we see her like leading us through this thing. Because narratively, she's the one kind of
she's the leader.
leading
She's
us
the one
through.
showing you where to go. Which makes the parts when you're alone stand out that much more, because you can't like, the more we can get you to rely on your allies, the more you feel their absence, the more you learn to care about them. And we're kind of establishing a lot of these rules or these feelings with Tess, but it really comes into play later when you're with Ellie and you're learning to rely on her more and more. So like when you're in the hotel basement, you feel that absence. You feel. I want to talk about how we scaled up the giant Firefly pendants so you could read them. This was more like, yeah, back then we had to like think more about non-high definition TVs and things that we don't worry as much about anymore.
Sure. But still, to get that to read from far away.
Yeah.
And then we're introducing more symbols of the Firefly here. Still not
what we're used to, but it's
Oh, man.
close.
I remember like just coming up with the name Fireflies took forever, and the original scripts, they were actually, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, they were called The Last of Us. Like that was the name of the group, and now the idea there'd be Last of Us graffiti all over the environment, and like a bunch of people, rightfully so, was like, this feels, even the actors feel like this feels a little cheesy to like have the name of the game as like a group, and tried all these different names before I came up with this idea of I think it was like the day or two before we were recording, I was like texting Jacob Minkoff, at the time the lead designer, and I was like, how do you feel about Firefly? I feel like this is pretty strong, and like I like this idea there's like this light in the darkness. And he's like, oh yeah, that kind of works. Are you worried about the Firefly TV show? I'm like, nah, it's gonna be fine. No one's gonna make that connection.
There's our culprit.
So
Again, establishing the rules of the spores and the mass.
Your eyes and ears open.
I was gonna say, we're obviously learning also about the flashlight too, and I know we went through a lot of work to get
The flashlights to work right, and sort of like all the different
You okay?
ideas, but like what
Damn ceiling's falling
I know
apart.
so
Be
much of this
careful.
game is meant to be grounded as well, but it's
This
like,
way.
what was the importance of getting a flashlight to
feel like a flashlight in real life. It could have just been obviously
Squeeze through.
generally a light, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, so much of the game's lighting is natural light because there's most areas in the game, unlike the quarantine zone, don't have electricity, and there was all this tech that had to be developed, and our team had to work on like just soft bounce lighting coming from the outside, bouncing in. Otherwise, everything would just be too dark. But we also knew because the genre is horror at times that it's important to just remove, like you want to remove or reduce the player's senses, and the more you do that, the more they kind of have to use their imagination, and they get more and more creeped out. And that's why knowing the flashlight is going to be such an integral part of that, put all this effort, and this is a combination of art and tech of playing with the idea of of the flashlight bouncing. So actually, wherever the flashlight hits, we check what color it's hitting, and then we do a raycast, and we bounce that color in the surrounding areas. And it was, again, we can't do quite real global illumination, but it's a simulation. It's like a close proximity of that. You're doing it with one light source, and it's this really nice, realistic effect that we're getting.
I want to talk about the
Well, I was
most
gonna say,
brutal
Kurt, why
tutorial
did
of
you
all
kill him?
time. How do you
Well-
aim and shoot?
well, so again, like this is the first time as a player you're
Making a moral choice.
Yeah.
but the instructions say shoot.
Well, we're teaching
The
you.
instructions
It is a
tell you
choice.
how to shoot. It actually
Sure.
doesn't tell you shoot. It's just like, here's how you shoot. You decide whether you shoot or not. But again, I don't remember exactly where the idea came from, but I'm sure there was like, we had a brainstorm of like, okay, we need to establish what happens if you breathe these spores? What are the consequences of that? And to show that in the game, and here's like another smuggler that has failed, their mask broke, and to say they'd rather die, and then at some point someone says, I'm not sure where this came from, is like someone says, oh, this is where we could train the aim and shooting mechanic. And it's such a lovely moment of like those, the more we can like double up on ideas and make them elegant, it always kind of impresses us in hindsight.
Do you think there's also anything in terms of like, we've already seen Joel that way, that there might be people who are like, okay, well, like Joel, we've already established what Joel is like as a player when I'm not in control of him, and now I'm doing this, so it just sort of felt okay to also be like, okay, press to shoot, you know, and giving.
Yeah, it's like not just Joel, but anybody in this world. Because like at the end of the day, we have to deal with, okay, if you don't shoot, what are the consequences of that? And like, okay, then we scripted test to shoot. So it's like either you're going to do it or Test's going to do it, and it's not going to be a big deal for these characters to establish this is what they do on a regular basis.
Wait, does she shoot? Or
Yeah.
does it- oh, okay.
He will shoot. You don't shoot.
Forget what happens in there.
So you didn't do a good job with stealth there. I think that's a downfall
Well,
of
this
our
Who do you think
playthroughs.
you are? Troy Baker?
Well, well, I think it's really hard to stealth there because that's the tutorial for melee. We do the one grab, and then we put you in a situation where it's nearly impossible to stealth, so that you get spotted and you see what that's like, and you learn, oh, square's the melee button, here's how I melee, okay, punch things. This was, yeah, all set up as a tutorial for that.
It's impressive how good this game looks all these years later. Just like I'm looking at the spore effect, and I was like, wow, that's like we did a lot more than I remember that we did.
teach you to turn it off in the daylight.
Fresh air. That's the one thing I love about the upgrade.
Again, you just fought, killed all these infected, and
Don't you ask Bill to get you some of them air
not a
fresheners?
big deal.
Hey,
And these lines
fired,
about
that'd be a
Bill
good
is
idea.
something we did after the fact. So the nice thing of like, we write the big beats first, and then because the in-game dialogue comes in last, we could then say like, oh, Bill knows Tess, and Bill likes to know these characters. How can we establish that here and throw in hints? So that later when you're on to Bill, it doesn't feel like it's completely out of nowhere. There's been some mention.
Damn it. Plank fell down.
Go get it.
Gotta go down and get it.
I want to make sure we got some of the questions from chat, because there's some really good ones as we're sort of going through these sections. Did you have a favorite scene that you wrote for Last of Us? When you look back, was there one that you thought was your favorite one in the process of writing? I don't know how precious you are sometimes with what you write, so.
No, it's actually like, I think we pride ourselves at Naughty Dog that we're not very precious, that it is so much about iteration.
I think I can handle it.
It's hard to choose. I mean, what comes to mind right now is the very end, the last conversation between Joel and Ellie, because I remember I was for a long time stuck and not sure how to end it. And meaning like the whole, everything that happens in the hospital, that was locked for a long time, but that final conversation, and it's just, when I finally I didn't know what I was going to write, and I just sat down, and it just kind of all just came out.
Bossy today.
And I couldn't at the time explain like why it needed to be that. I just know that felt right. And it sounds like so kind of silly. And now I can better explain why that works structurally of like, you know, here's a guy that we need to show greater and greater sacrifice of what he's willing to give up to save this girl. And the idea that, you know, by sacrificing all of humanity, you think that's the end. Well, that's the most he's willing to give up. But actually, no. The thing that's most important to him is this relationship with this girl. And by lying to her and having that ending, it shows that he's willing to sacrifice that relationship to protect her. Like how far a parent is willing to go for a child. Like, at the time, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. I was just like, no, it's got to be this.
Sure.
I remember there's some people like on the team like arguing like it doesn't feel satisfying or doesn't quite have like a strong finish, but it just felt right.
When you find yourself that you're unsure at that moment, as a writer, are there any things that you do to try to like break yourself out of that moment, or sort of try to move past it?
I think you just like you try as many other ideas as you can. So like, okay, this feels right, but maybe there's some doubt. Let me try 8 other different things, and then step back and say, okay, does this still feel like the best idea? Like that way, I've kept myself open to other ideas that could be better. And sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes like, actually, no, this one is better. Okay, well, we got to dump this because ultimately you got to serve the game. And sometimes those other ideas, right, don't come from me, or like it might come from anybody on the team. So you always try to remain open to that. But sometimes your first instinct, that gut feeling, is the best one, and you got to listen to that as well.
Soldiers, none of Robert's men, yeah?
Just a comment on the plank puzzle we were doing earlier.
Yep.
That was another example of like, we're thinking
Wanna
about
make it more interesting?
our ally and how to incorporate them into our like puzzles. That we never want to have a puzzle where the player just does everything and the buddy is just sitting there watching. So you're like handing the plank up to her, she picks it up, she places it over. Yes, I've seen that. I guess the player hasn't placed a thing over a gap yet, but we're setting that up that the player can do that later by the buddy doing it. And yeah, it just feels more realistic.
This guy is also Troy Baker right here.
This guy, I can't look at it.
Do you record these when you bring people back to do some of the, necessarily the pickup lines, but the gameplay voiceover? Then you decide, oh, well, you're good to record these other lines for some of the NPCs, or?
Yeah, usually we're like, for voice actors, they'll come in and they know like you're doing these many characters, and there's a SAG limit, I forget, of how many characters they're allowed to do per session. I don't remember how that one with Troy happened. I might have just asked him to like jump in and do this like voice he does as a joke sometimes.
Fight. Actually does resolve.
In a similar point, Kurt, what is
Malik, sit back down.
Sorry, Tess.
This little sequence is to show the power that Tess has in this kind of black market area. In a way, people fear her more than they fear Joel.
Old headache. Don't ask.
Did you have a favorite scene that you worked on, or part, or just, sorry, let's just say favorite part of The Last of Us, Kurt?
In terms of scene, my favorite scene, which is a popular one, is when Joel follows Ellie to the cabin, and they have their "You're not my daughter" thing.
The guy's been hoarding all sorts of
Yeah, it's just a
shit
very
back
beautiful.
Whoa,
Just
hold
the
on.
way it's lit, the way it
Yeah.
kind of their relationship coming to a head. I
And
remember
just
when I
Troy and Ashley's performance is like
yeah,
pretty
I remember
incredible.
like being kind of fresh, seeing the project kind of fresh eyes. That scene stood out as like I was like tearing up watching it the first couple times.
I'm looking for Robert. You come through here?
Half hour ago. He went back to the wharf.
That shaky
Yeah, no.
cam. It's a little too shaky. It's like you can't turn it off. Like this especially now when we're like just looking at the game at a part 2 and just like nitpicking everything we could polish with the time we have left. Like you can't help but look at this, be like, oh man, I would
so
fix
many-
that. I would fix this. I
so
would change
many
that. That
things
lighting could be better.
That are like not okay anymore.
It's like
Tess bumping up against you and weird janky pop stuff that nowadays you just can't.
even like
can't
the
get
idea of
away
like
with.
starting a cutscene like this just by walking forward. Like so much of like our language now is like start.
Everything's
On an
seamless.
action. Everything has to be on an action. We can't just take control away without motivating it in some way.
Our beef
Sure.
isn't with you. We just won't run.
So this is the first sort of like full combat setup against
The
humans.
focus is not quite right. Like,
Without Robert.
should we just start writing notes and like putting
It's right
the
in
design, because you have to teach the player every mechanic in this very thoughtful and slow enough paced way that they don't get overwhelmed with tutorial. You're kind of trying to tutorialize things invisibly in a way that they didn't realize they just got taught something.
Give me your hand.
yeah, which is why people are sometimes surprised that the opening is the last thing we do, because we never, like, for a long time we don't know where our mechanics are going to land. Like, are we going to have a cover button? Or we're not going to have a cover button? We went back and forth so many times during production of this game before we kind of got into more of our analog cover
Over here,
system. So you don't know what you're going to train until you know what your mechanics are, and they're
Sure.
locked down. And then at some point, okay, we're locking these down so we can start working on how we're going to train all of them.
What were the decisions in terms of like we're talking about mechanics and training? What were the decisions around how we implemented cover here?
Instead of having a cover button, right? I know that was always sort of a debate for our game. So what was the choice to move away from that and have something a little more fluid?
Well, just having a cover button, it just makes the movement a little stickier, which can work in like an action sequence where you want to just sprint somewhere. And for example, Uncharted, the character moves so quickly. If you didn't have a cover button, you can easily like run past the corner and miss it. And for that game, cover really works. But for this, that was much slower, more methodical. We felt if we could make it work without a cover button, it will feel better. But like we had a version that didn't quite work, had potential, and then we lost confidence in it. We went down the whole road of implementing a cover system, which uses different animation, different thing. And I remember like at one day like having a late dinner with Bruce, and we're talking about the cover button. He's like, I think we should go back to the analog thing. It's like, but I feel bad because we led the people down this road. And I was like, yeah, I hear you. Actually, when you saying that, like I felt the same way. I was like, I think we got to make that call. It's one of those like really hard decisions where like you have to then bring the team together, be like, look, we're sorry, we led you down this road. It's the wrong road for this game. We got to kind of do a course correction
And some of
go
that
this other way.
remains like he does have custom animations for being
Yeah.
cover when you're near it.
But he had all
So-
these like entrance animations
yeah,
of like so you could do from far away, which felt cool. And that's the thought. Like, okay, there's certain really kind of interesting and like flashy aspect we're going to lose because now we can't really have a cover animation from far away because we don't always know if you want to enter cover or just run past it.
Sure.
And those are sometimes the just hard decisions you got to make that will haunt you for the rest of your life.
There's a good question since we're talking about decisions that will haunt you for the rest of your life.
and looking at our game critically now after this, are there any regrets of something that you had to cut, or maybe an idea that you didn't get to that maybe looking back on it, you're like, oh, I wish I may have made a different decision here. And I think we feel pretty good about this, but
Things that we aren't fixing in part 2.
I think we wouldn't want to do. I don't think so. Nothing's coming. I'm sure there are. I just like nothing big is coming to mind right now. But that just could be just my bad memory.
I mean, so much of that stuff gets put into a sequel, or like things that we've already addressed with stuff we've already showed of part 2. What?
you need
Where's
the
the
key.
stupid
Kurt.
key? I don't. Oh, it's on the guy.
I mean, the biggest thing, and again, it's not a regret. Like, there was a time when we had a dodge button in this game, and we could not make combat work, especially against infected, and like, either it was too easy or way too hard, and we couldn't quite strike the balance. And when we took the dodge button out, everything fell into place for this game. And now, like, having played so much of part 2, it's like that's the hardest thing for a lot of us to go back to and not have the dodge button. It's like the thing that you miss.
Trying to do,
but with the time we had, with the resources we had, we couldn't make it work for this game. So I feel like we made the best decisions for this game. So maybe if we had developed the whole thing from scratch, we would make different decisions, but there's nothing I quite regret for this game.
There's certain mechanics that could have been trained better, like combinations of things, like when you throw a bottle at someone to stun them, that you can do a more powerful melee. A lot of people didn't know that. Things that we're trying to address. Oh wow, okay. Can't just punch me.
I mean, the idea of stopping power right there is like, if you're going to keep charging at someone, like, their shots will stop you dead in your tracks. Was important to establish, like, you can't just brute force your way through this. You have to, like, come in at angles, and teaching the player to run was really hard. Like, it's okay to run away. And we had to, like, over and over kind of re-emphasize that in the game.
How much of that is difficult, let's say difficulty or combat balance in terms of teaching the player to run, in terms of like the stakes, or is it more, I mean, is it a combination of things? Like,
it's a combination of like how the enemies behave, like I'm saying, the stopping power is like, okay, I can't just keep running at this guy. It's layout, it's like what are the options, what are the shapes in the environment that can kind of lead you in different ways. It could be death hints, like what hints do we throw on the screen when you die? Like, sometimes it's seeing your ally do something, so if your ally is running and calling you over, then you might be encouraged to do what they're doing. And it's like, you gotta look at everything you have in your toolbox and just kind of keep hitting it on the head. Because we saw once players were running away, they were having like such a unique experience with this game that they haven't felt in like stealth game or action games, because there's such a combination of those two things. But getting them to do something they've never done in the game before is really hard.
Was there anything that we found particularly difficult to tutorialize in all of the different, both mechanics, but also training, like the effectiveness of different weapons or scavenging? Was there something that we felt was a challenge to tutorialize to the player?
I remember it was like, we didn't really want to have these like incredibly detailed panel, like we have the big tutorial that pops up. It was kind of a necessity. There's so many mechanics in this game that we felt like, we had to pull up the whole panel and say, here's this mechanic, how it works, just in case. We can't say we didn't tell you.
Like, talking about things we could have trained better, there is, because we wanted the backpack to be so integral, and we didn't want to pause the game when you go in your backpack, like, we came with the decision, like, okay, you could have all these weapons that you upgrade, and we want you to have more of a connection with your weapons than you do in something like Uncharted, where you're constantly swapping out weapons. But therefore, you can't have all your weapons available to you all the time. You have to swap them into your slots. And sometimes players miss that. And like, we had someone on the team that like played the whole game with just whatever their default weapons were. I didn't realize they had all these other weapons in their backpack. So that's something in hindsight I wish we would have done a better job of training and teaching the player. And I think we do a much better job of it in another game.
Good takedown.
Let's talk about this space. It feels like, for me, it feels like we went from, okay, we taught you combat in a certain space. We're obviously teaching you to flank and turn around. But it feels like we've exponentially increased the complexity and difficulty in the next setup. What is it that we're trying to...
Well, it's like we taught you how to stealth, we taught you how to melee, we taught you how to shoot. We taught you kind of how the AI for these enemies works. And now it's like, here's a playground for you to use everything you've learned. And you kind of need to use everything you've learned to get to the next spawn. So it's almost like a...
I think it's the first place you can use a melee weapon to... These guys, yeah, there's melee on melee. Oh, that's right, you can beat them with a brick. Another thing people don't know.
Even like how saturated some of these icons are, and that bugged me a little bit. And then like the grime on some of the icons, again, was something that was cool, an aesthetic that was cool at the time, but now it's like, it feels like we could have had something cleaner.
How much, was there any work, was there any iteration in terms of teaching the player when he's been caught, as far as human NPCs, obviously, like, I think it's a little more obvious with infected.
And where did that drone come from?
Yeah.
That's like such a unique thing, I feel like, to The Last of Us.
I don't remember where exactly the idea
it's just
came
the
from.
sound, which is, I mean, yeah, that's one of those
I
things
just
where-
remember, like, yeah, for a long time how players were overwhelmed with not having a lot of stealth indicators on screen, and we were like adding a lot, removing them, adding them, removing it, and that's where eventually we settled on listen mode. They're like, here's a way to give you more information, because we didn't want to do a mini map, and because at the time there were a lot of stealth games that had like a mini map, and like you would either mark enemies or just based on like you would see it all in this. And then we're like, okay, then you're just playing the mini map. You're not playing what's actually on the screen. You're not rotating the camera around. So the listen mode felt like a good compromise in that regard.
Trying to ground it in a world of,
Yeah.
it's a visualization of what you would hear in real life,
Yeah.
but since you're watching on a TV,
Gun down.
Especially with this game, sound was like so integral to like what the experience is and how you hear where players are, but not everyone has a good 5.1 surround system. So like, okay, how do we visualize sound in like a different way?
Now we go into a chase sequence. Are there anything on a game design side, or is it narrative, to like make the character, the player, feel like you've got to keep chasing? Like if you slow down, you've got a fail state, for example, or there's something, right? Like you're running out of time.
it's really hard to try to like give you a glimpse of the character every turn you make, and you can see them running, even if it's fake.
Hello, Robert.
And you have some thresholds of, you know, how much time you feel like is appropriate to give the player. Are they just standing there looking?
No hard
You want to
feelings.
give some alternate paths,
at all.
but let them go down those and then still be able to recover, so you feel this sense of disorientation for a little
missed
bit.
you.
Then like, yeah, seeing Robert like,
Whatever it is
oh,
you
run,
learned,
just
it ain't
made it
true.
around the corner. Oh, he went that way.
The guns.
The little
You wanna tell us
physics
where the
on
guns
the thingy is like moving.
Yeah, sure.
Like he just ran through there.
It's
That's kind
complicated.
of faked, just to give you a
Look,
sense
all right,
of
just hear me out on this.
he went that
I
way.
got this.
I love their dynamic here. It's again, Tess is doing all the talking, and then when Robert does the wrong thing, all Tess has to do is give Joel a look and understanding they have this shorthand. This is what they do on a regular basis.
Sure.
Yeah.
What was it like shooting the scene? Was there anything?
Excuse
Was it always going to play out this way?
Yeah, I
You
don't think
owe
I
us.
I think we're trying to figure out what's the best way for him to break Robert's arm. And I think there were
So
versions where
brutal.
like he had like
Well, I might have done
just
that
the
if you
geography of
hadn't
it didn't quite make sense. Where like he'd put his
Who
arm
has our
over like
guns?
2 pieces and then he'd like kind of stomp it and it would break in the middle. But even though these scenes are dark, they're actually surprisingly fun to shoot because everybody on the set is friendly and like they do something like this and then we yell cut and they're just everyone's
Has our
laughing.
guns?
Sure.
Like the limpness in his arm there, just for a couple frames, you see is like dangled, unnatural arm. Brutal.
What?
I think this is the first time also we get a sense of the brutality that
Go in there, finish
Joel
him
is
off.
capable of.
We get the guns.
Yeah.
What do you
I
say?
mean, Tess is the most.
Come on.
We didn't talk about before
Fuck
when we
those
first
fireflies.
introduced in that first combat
Let's go get
setup.
'em.
Tess is just like,
That is
fuck
a
this,
stupid
and shoots the guy. And that just sets the tone like, oh, she's gonna be
Yeah.
okay with murdering people.
Well, now what?
So you kind of know Robert isn't getting out
Get our
of this.
merchandise.
And even though like they
don't
killed
know.
someone in cold blood
Explain it to
and
them.
it's like sigh, now what? It's
Right.
like they're not even worried
Yeah,
about
yeah.
this kind of horrible murder that they just committed.
To look very far.
Yeah, that looked pretty jaded.
The great Merle Dandridge.
Yes.
Merle is one of my favorite actors to work with. For those who don't know, Merle
Why
was
are you here?
the original Alex
Business.
fans and brought her in because
You weren't looking so hard.
we were such fans of that game, and
Where's Robert?
she just again was so good as Marlene. Yeah, sometimes you work with an actor that's so
need to
good,
have
you
a
just
life.
don't even cast
The
them.
guns
Like
he gave you,
she's in Uncharted
they weren't
4
his
as
to
the
sell.
old lady in
I
the
want them
manor.
back. Doesn't work like that, Tess. The hell it doesn't. I paid
Would
for
love
those
to work
guns.
with her again.
You want them back? You're gonna have to earn them. How many cards are we talking about? I don't give a damn.
So, I mean, very often we're really establishing, we're talking, the queue line and
I need
stuff,
something
like the
smothered
power
out
of the
of this.
ration cards. It
You do
paid for
that?
information. It's paying for guns, right? Like the scarcity of all that.
How do we know you guys?
It's just when you're writing, you're constantly asking, okay, what do these
Well,
characters
you're the
want?
military.
What are they
Yeah.
after?
Yeah,
What is their motivation?
They can't just do things for the sake of the plot. Like the plot tells you where you need to go,
you
but
the
then how do you
weapons.
motivate it from a character standpoint? It's like, okay, then ration
move.
cards are how you
What's it gonna
survive. These kind of like black
wanna see
market
those
goods is
guns.
what these characters
Follow me.
deal with. They need to follow Marlene now because she has their supplies,
gotta
and
get
that's
outta
what you're
here.
going to go next, and eventually that's going to lead you to Ellie, which is where we know we need to end up plot-wise. But again, everything has to be driven character-wise.
Sure. Well, I think this is a good spot to end the stream for today, just after the introduction of Marlene. Please make sure to join us as we continue our Last of Us Remastered playthrough. We'll be playing next week on March 11th. Thank you to everyone who joined us watching the stream and on chat. Thank you for your questions. As always, we'll try to get through as many as we can. We didn't get through a ton, but there's some great questions in here that we're trying to get through. Thank you to our esteemed guests, Neil and Kurt. Thanks so much, Kurt,
job,
for
Kurt.
playing.
Good job.
Excellent job. I want to thank you to our crew, as always, Dina and Chris and Jonathan, Rob, Jacqueline, Sam back there behind the controls, Grant, and of course Ashley on the questions and in chat. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And then be sure, if you want to watch more of these streams, to follow us on YouTube and Twitch. Make sure, again, you hit follow, subscribe, and then also, as usual, the notify button so you know when we're going online. Thanks a lot. See you next week.
Underneath the bridge, it's all been sprung a leak, and I'm living off of grass and the drippings from the ceiling. It's okay to eat fish, 'cause they don't have any feelings. Something in the way, something in the way, yeah.
PlayStation